Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of our ITSS Verona member series. My colleague Arslan and I are part of the Human Security Research team, and today we're talking about the topic of climate change and security. We have the honor of hosting Dr. Duraid, lecturer at the King's College Defense Studies Department and founder and co-director of the Environmental Security Research Group. He teaches across a range of intermediate and advanced courses at the UK Defence Academy, as well as online courses for the School of Security Studies, and is an expert in the fields of education, conflict, and security. Dr. Duraid, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Well, this is a very interesting topic, and I really look forward to delving into it. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about climate change and environmental disasters as prime security threats. That these are issues of concern is now unquestionable. And currently, half the cities of over 500,000 inhabitants are at risk of exposure to one or more types of natural disasters. As the world becomes progressively more urban and climate change continues to worsen, the risks increase exponentially. How do you see these threats transforming the national security principles or operations of state actors?
Thank you. A really, really good question. And I think it's important quickly to set out a bit of kind of context to this question, in addition to what you've put, which is that I think when we talk about climate change in relation to this, in relation to being a threat, we need to interrogate that idea that climate change and natural disasters, as you mentioned, are a form of threat. This is still quite a disputed concept. A lot of scholarship and policy labels climate change not as a threat, but as a kind of threat multiplier. It exacerbates threats, or it accelerates those threats. So I mean, if we look at conflicts or security threats where climate change has exacerbated that issue, there are many other factors at play, corruption, underinvestment in infrastructure, economic mismanagement, and so forth. And climate change is one of those factors. And we apply this to sort of more obvious aspects such as interstate conflict, migration, or conflict between riparian states. But you sort of talk about extreme weather events, and that is another area where, climate change it could be seen as an exacerbator to that kind of threat. And an increasing number of scholars, for example, and commentators are arguing we need to move away from the term natural disaster. You see this in the no natural disasters movement, hashtag no natural disasters. And the rationale for this is that the impact of these sort of environmental disasters are exacerbated by man-made emissions, but also their impact on populations is a result of human decisions. We've built our towns and cities in the path of hurricanes and wildfires and floods, and our governments aren't doing enough to reorient our infrastructures and urban planning to account for these facts. So it's important for us to be careful about how we use these terms. If the public discourse about climate change shifts too far towards labeling it as a security threat, then it might end up resulting in governments investing far more in security-based solutions rather than development activities or environmental solutions. So all of that being said, you're absolutely spot on. The impact of climate change and environmental hazards continue to be sort of increasingly significant, and it's having a disproportionate impact, as you note, on communities in the global south. It's also having a disproportionate impact on women in particular. How is this transforming the national security sort of principles or operations of state actors? I can't obviously speak to all militaries worldwide, but if we look at some of the militaries that are making the biggest noise about this on the international stage, the US, the UK, Australia, and so forth, some forces across the EU, like Scandinavia particularly, I'd argue that their responses, their security principles and operations have been fairly predictable. And they've sought to integrate climate and sustainability issues in a way that doesn't upset the status quo too much. So for example, what we find across a number of national security strategies is a continued preference for framing climate and biodiversity issues in relation to more traditional security challenges in comparison to human security challenges. This is obviously very disappointing for a number of commentators. It demonstrates that tendency to maintain the status quo. And there's obviously a lot of reasons why forces and nations might want to maintain that status quo. The human security narrative is very complex, and it's politically inexpedient for governments to push that narrative, and an increased focus on human security could bring into question the value of a wide range of our existing platforms and capability and strategies. So that's a kind of key area, I think, that is the climate threat is not transforming national security principles too much. And I think that links with the second really important way in which climate security challenges are transforming sort of national security principles, which is that they are being used, the challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss is being used as a rationale for expanding the role of the security function. There's a particular focus here on the likely increase in humanitarian and disaster relief operations, but there are wider areas that are being looked at in terms of this expansion. You've got peace building, conflict resolution, you've got diplomacy, climate diplomacy, and the military potentially being involved in that, the use of the military to support and provide resources for adaptation and resilience building, and even sort of the use of surveillance intelligence systems for climate risk modeling, early warning systems, anti-poaching activities, conservation activities, and so forth. It's not unfeasible that you'll find this expanding into wider areas as we progress. You know, if climate disinformation comes to be seen as a security threat, then the military might, you know, want to get involved in countering that sort of those disinformation activities. So climate change and biodiversity loss are being used as a rationale for expanding the role of security functions. I'd say there's also an increasing focus on the concept of adaptation and resilience in particular. That's maybe one real notable area of change, and that's particularly within research that say that this is good because it shifts our focus into building up, let's say, communities in ways that enable them to sort of respond to these challenges in comparison to focusing on the traditional security architecture. But it's also a very nice fuzzy concept, resilience. You know, what is resilience? It could be used to mean so many different things. And that enables the government to bring together a wide range of kind of diverse actors and issues under a code to keep it quite generalized as to what they mean, to provide a nice amount of leeway, let's say. So overall, I'd say range. I'd recommend for anyone who kind of wants to look at a key piece of evidence for this is the recently released UK Integrated Review, which is a big document that outlines the UK government's strategic vision for security and development. And we find a reframing of previous climate security concepts that they've already talked about in previous reviews, but they provide more word count and emphasis to those concepts So whilst their strategies aren't necessarily, is far greater.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. And it's true that we hear today so much about urban resilience, but there's very little to be said about specific guidelines or specific changes. And I also felt very strongly what you talked about, what real changes are being made to actually promote human security and the marginalization of certain communities like Indigenous people or women in these kinds of
Right,
discourses about climate change. So thank you so
sorry,
much.
and
My
you're
next
absolutely
question,
spot on in
sorry.
terms of those things are sort of connected as well. And I mean, this idea that security strategies would engage with resilience concepts, what that could mean is that they end up dominating resilient or seeking to support resilience activities in a way that means we overlook other ways in which we could achieve resilience. So, you know, survivor-led resilience within sort of communities, particularly in weather scenarios.
Amazing. And you know, there is a tendency, as always, to go to the more securitized vision. Just to follow also on your work, that it's beyond fascinating. Your work is also focused on catalyzing organizational change within the security sector, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you see military and security organizations adapting to the threat of climate change themselves, and because, you know, in a dual way, military must adapt their operations and strategies to predict or even try and leverage the dynamics of climate change, you know, for the purpose of strengthening national security or foreign defense policy. So do you see these dynamics changing the way the military behaves? Are there any specific patterns or trends emerging?
Definitely. I mean, it's important to say up front that obviously the ways in which militaries and security organizations will adapt to climate changes, that's going to be significantly influenced by their rationale for adapting and whether they're strengths or whether they're choosing to adapt. You know, whether that's for kind of ethical reasons or more likely to reduce their future operational and strategic risks. So, and there's, you know, and there's some interesting research on this about the principle that the sort of changes, let's say, in military output varies, and that's reflective of a state's understanding of the impact of climate change on national security. I'd say, you know, there's that difference between militaries, but there's also difference within militaries. They are not monolithic institutions. So as long as those variations across different regions and states and different militaries, you'll see variations in the way that different services within a military respond, different regiments and corps within those services, and even individual bases or barracks. Now, sustainability is the perfect example of this that you bring up, and you're very diplomatic, I would say, by saying that, you know, militaries are polluting organizations because, you know, they are hugely polluting organizations. The US Department of Defense, for example, it's been fairly strongly argued that it is the large emitter of greenhouse gases of any, you know, type or form of organization. So that one organization is the largest organizational emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide. Its emissions are the same as the entire emissions of Portugal or Peru, there or thereabouts. So they are hugely, hugely polluting organizations. Even, you know, if you move to a smaller country such as the UK MOD, their greenhouse gas emissions make up perhaps 1% of all UK emissions, and are equivalent to, you know, the emissions of another country, you know, such as I think the UK MOD, I may be wrong, but I think it's got about the same emissions as Uruguay or something like that. So there are a lot of sort of there's a lot of pressure for change. There's a lot of fairly damning studies about the potential for militaries to change this scenario. There are studies that show that there's a sort of causal link, a two-way causal link between military expenditure and greenhouse gas emissions. And this has led to significant shifts, definitely in the way that the militaries are seeking to engage with system. And I would say that those shifts are picking up pace. So there is an increased focus on sustainability, and that is growing all the time. Roadmap for sustainability, for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It came out of that in March, and that's being seen as a kind of test case by other militaries. You know, the US Department of Defense is looking at how the UK is going to achieve that in order to see whether it can manage that process whilst maintaining its effectiveness as a force. You know, can they actually upscale their use of biofuels within their, you know, within their sort of jet planes sufficiently? You know, how do they supply that? So there are significant shifts going on there and significant pressure, not only from external parties, but also internal. What's important, I would say, is that, and I think what's in shift in comparison to what we've seen before, is that with the increased knowledge and technology that we now have, it's possible for military officials who are pushing for this agenda to actually frame sustainability in a way that's much more palatable for the more conservative elements of those military forces and the security sector. So you see a lot of, you see the framing of sustainability as a means of enhancing effectiveness. It enhances financial savings and technological capabilities and strategic and operational resilience, and it mitigates the risk of the military. You know, it mitigates their legal risk, it reduces their risk of, you know, bad public relations as the public increasingly, you know, seeks to have more environmentally conscious organizations. So it's now possible to frame it in that way, which enables them to push that agenda, you know, hopefully at a greater pace. That's not to say that things are perfect and everything is, you know, and everything's going in the right direction. There are obviously significant issues. You know, if we frame these sustainability changes as a means of enhancing effectiveness, that could create some really negative sort of second and third order effects. You might have sustainability arms race. You know, if you're seeking to create forces that can deploy for long times, that are capable of being sustained without any form of external logistics, because they have their own, you know, they have their own energy sources, they have their own food, you know, sustainable food sources. You can have a kind of military environmental complex that creates this kind of sustainability arms race, but one that is targeted towards effectiveness in combat, let's say. And you have, you know, the potential that this sustainability narrative, you know, we talked earlier about securitization. Will it be used? Will you use military operations and increased sustainability outreach to actually position yourself, let's say, in a nation, you know, through your climate diplomacy, through your sort of outreach activities, to position yourself in strategically valuable regions or nations? And the more obvious aspect of this is that many would argue that the current sustainability targets and goals are still not radical or fast enough, particularly given those kind of statistics that we talked about before, about how polluting these organizations are. And you see a lot of those concerns relate to, they're very similar to the concerns that you have to wider sustainability roadmaps and targets. You know, there's a tendency in military thinking to assume that we'll find some, you know, some new or cheaper technology that will help tackle 50% of the problem or something like that. You know, that's obviously a commonly used and often criticized policy development habit, and the military does definitely fall into that trap. So there are a lot of concerns about, you know, there's a good shift here in terms of the policies they're developing. There are some serious criticisms criticisms that we, let's say, the ambition or the sort of the structure of those policies. But I would say that to cap off, and I know I've been rambling on, I'd say that for me personally, what's actually really, really important to note is that, and you know, within the Defence Studies Department, our role is to engage in military officer education. You know, we work with the UK MOD and with international forces to sort of provide education about contemporary security threats, strategic planning, and so forth. Beyond this external messaging and these conceptual targets that are being put out there by militaries, you know, in the statements that are being put out there about sustainability, there is really a noticeable, visible internal shift in the perspectives of military personnel. There's a groundswell of senior officers with a real personal desire to contribute in a sort of positive and significant way to mitigating the climate crisis rather than simply responding to its repercussions. So you can see that a lot in the classes that we engage in, the emphasis of formal and informal discussions of essay submissions of the officers that are attending those courses has evolved hugely, and it's far more concentrated now on climate change, biocapacity loss as kind of predominant threats for security and international relations. And there's a lot of honest criticisms by these officers regarding what they see as a lack of institutional commitment, a lack of leadership and transparency and effective policy. And they are increasingly pushing upwards for those things. So there's a beyond those kind of external policies, there's a really interesting and I would say exciting internal cultural shift that's going on. And whilst militaries are monolithic and traditionalist institutions, and whilst you still have a lot of that mindset of environmental exceptionalism, like so many organizations, there's, you know, they contain a lot of individuals who want to contribute to helping to mitigate the impacts of you know, the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis. So I think I see a lot of hope there in what, you know, in that change becoming a bit more radical, or in that change certainly being not purely a matter of greenwashing, but something that genuinely has institutional buy-in from across military personnel.
Thank you so much. And it's also wonderful to hear your firsthand experience with this. So thank you for that really insightful response.